Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here. We are here for my LCK Cup, my LCK Winter Split plans, overview, and analysis video. We are down to, I guess, our top 9 teams. I know that feels like it's not necessarily a cut down, but one team has officially been eliminated. The regular season is technically over. It's time for the quote-unquote plans, a small little bracket to see who will qualify to be the other 3 teams going in to the playoffs besides the 3 that qualified out of the regular season. It's been a very weird format. It's been a very short split already here in winter, but we are barreling towards the playoffs. I think some people probably expected this video to be broken up into a couple of smaller ones to go over each series individually. I just didn't think that was necessary for the play-ins. This feels more like an extended version of the regular season than it does like any actual play-in or playoff bracket, and so I'm just including the entire tournament, the entire bracket, in one video here. I'll be going over each series in basically the same way that I would a regular season video, and then obviously once we get to the actual playoffs, when we start getting into like the actual qualification for first stand, that's when I'll start going game by game. That's when I'll start doing things a lot more similarly to how a lot of people are accustomed to me covering the playoffs on this channel. I hope that makes a lot of sense, but in today's video, we are going to be going over all 5 series. We will be talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and of course, at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. I will not be updating any power rankings at the end of this video. It doesn't necessarily feel like there needs to be any sort of power rankings update because we're going into the playoff bracket. I will be talking about the playoff bracket, giving some predictions, giving some thoughts and opinions, and all of that fun stuff. I certainly think the bracket played out in a pretty expected, but also kind of interesting way in terms of the matchups we're getting in the playoffs proper, so we'll definitely talk about who I think is going to be advancing in that regard, but most of today will be spent talking about these 5 series, these 4 best of 3s and 1 best of 5 that we got as play-ins into the playoffs. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Of course, no D plus Kia, no Gen G, and no KT Rolster. They have already qualified for the playoffs themselves as the top 3 seeds from the winners group and the top 3 seeds now in the playoffs. And of course, also no FearX, no BNK FearX, because they are the first team eliminated. They were 10th and winless in the actual regular season, so they did not make the play-in stage. Those 4 teams are out. That means the other 6 teams are going to be playing here today. Our first matchups are going to be between some of the teams that were a little bit more up in the air coming into this play-in stage, and that definitely kicks off with our first matchup, a rematch of one that we saw in the regular season, DRX taking on the DN Freecs. And DRX is going to be able to pick up the victory yet again. This is not really an upset. This would have been an upset, I think, at the beginning of the year when we kind of expected DNF to be a team that was competing for top 6 or at least kind of in the vicinity of top 6. Everything is kind of going wrong for this team right now. I'm going to point out some individual players that I just think are really, really awful right now. They are a team that I think is just not cohesive in any real meaningful way. This feels like a collection of 5 role players that can't really break through, and even when you do get 1 or 2 decent performances out of a couple of these players, you'd be hard-pressed to make an argument that they are like a complete team with really good synergy and really good communication. It just feels a little bit disconnected out there on the Rift, and that's not really the case for DRX. I think this team does work off of each other well. I think they capitalized on DNF's mistakes, but at the end of the day, it's the same exact thing we talked about in last week's video when we covered the end of the regular season, when we talked about what we expected here in the play-ins. If UCal is just going to be the best player on the Rift, which he has been for so many series that this team has played so far this year, then they're just going to be able to waltz to a victory here, and that's exactly what they did. UCal is the easiest possible choice for player of the series that you could possibly give because, once again, he is the guy for DRX. When they win games, when they're even competitive in a lot of these games, it's through him. He is their superstar player. He is the one that they are giving all of the resources to, and he is the one that's going to capitalize in the back half of these games. Shout out his almost penta in game number 2. He not only is having the most highlight moments in game, but he's having the big highlight moment out of game when he falls out of his chair after the Galio taunt accidentally takes his penta away. It's a very funny circumstance, and I'm not sure if the clip is available somewhere easily online, but I would go check that out if you can. It's very funny. UCal seems to be a very fun guy to play with and, to just have in the locker room, and if he's going to play as well as he did, not only in this series, but as he has over really the past 3 years, I mean, this guy is genuinely becoming one of the most valuable players in the world. I think we're actually starting to have a real conversation whether or not he is a top 10 player in the world. I think that is, like, actually something something you can really start talking about. Him and BDD have had like crazily similar years, and KT and DRX I think are very scarily similar teams at the current moment in terms of how they've ended up playing, and I just don't know if that's generally the perception of UCal. This guy has been absolutely monstrous coming back to the LCK, and we kind of knew that that was a possibility because of how good he was in the LPL for a bad Thunder Talk team for quite a while, but it's always fun to see a player that was so hyped and had so much promise when he was younger, you know, have to go and really rebuild his career in a different region, come back and then really excel here in the LCK. UCal is an absolute menace, and like he is genuinely one of the best players in the LCK, full stop. Certainly one of the most valuable, and he proved that once again here. The other player that I really want to shout out in a positive way is Sponge in the jungle. Sponge has had a gigantic glow up from last year. He was maybe the single worst player in the LCK in 2024. It just was not good. There really wasn't a lot that you could point to and like about his game, and I was really surprised that they ended up bringing him back. They brought in Juhan, or they brought back Juhan from the LEC, and it felt like he was going to be the starting jungler for this team to just give them at least some semblance of a floor. Clearly, they saw something they liked in terms of not only Sponge's like preseason performance, but his synergy with UCal, and you know what? That's translated almost immediately to the stage. Sponge has actually been really good. He's not been perfect. I wouldn't say he's been like a top 4, you know, jungler or anything like that, but he's been playable. Like, there are junglers that are worse. The jungler on the other side of this matchup in Pyosik was not only significantly worse in this series, but has been significantly worse across this entire split, and that's just a general positive for DRX. So if Sponge and UCal are actually going to be a very strong mid-jungle duo, if Sponge is going to step up and be like an average, like middle-of-the-pack jungler, and UCal can really carry games, like that's DRX's way to win. They won through the middle of the map here, and hopefully we're going to be able to see more of that. I think Teddy fits into that style really well. I talk about it all the time on this channel. If you want to get the most out of Teddy, you probably just want to play him weak side. You probably don't want to give him a ton of resources. Just kind of allow him to be good in lane and then good in team fights without really necessarily needing him to pop off or make these gigantic plays. If you have a superstar like UCal, or if you have someone like Sponge who is just going to win early like he is right now, Teddy is in a much better position to be that secondary or, you know, tertiary carry, like whatever you really need him to be in those instances. Like, he was really good in game 1 on the Kai'Sa. He was still really good in game 2 on the Ashe, but again, not being the main character, that's like the dream for Teddy, and that was a big problem with him last year, is he had to be the main character for DRX. Ondel, I think, is fine. I still think this team would be better if they had Playta in there in the support position, but Ondel's not been a disaster. I just don't think he's necessarily been particularly impressive. Rich is Rich, right? Like, he's not very good in lane. Dudu was definitely better in this series, and I'm not particularly impressed with him as a player, but he's not like so bad that you're going to lose games because of him. On the top side, he's just not necessarily going to be a positive. If UCal is the best player on the Rift, like, it's done and dusted. Like, he's just going to win games in those, you know, situations, and that's what makes this team right now better than a lot of the other middle of the pack teams in the LCK, is that other teams don't have a player like UCal. They don't have a player they can rely on to just go out there and basically win any matchup that they are in. DRX is scary, and they're going to be moving on to that second round. DNF, unfortunately, because of this loss, is now eliminated. This is, you know, single elimination until we get to the second round, and so DNF not actually qualifying to be able to play against one of the top 2 seeds here in the play-in stage. This is not surprising considering how they played in the regular season. This team had many problems in the regular season, and you know what? Not all of them came to fruition in this series. I think the solo laners were actually fine. Both of them were pretty disappointing, all things considered, in the regular season. Dudu, I think, definitely took a couple of steps back on the top side, and he was really good in this series, but at the end of the day, it's against Rich, and Rich just loses to everybody in lane, and so it's hard to kind of get a real, you know, thought or feeling about that. Hopefully, Dudu can kind of pick things back up once we go into spring, but Bulldog wasn't an absolute nightmare in this series like he has been at times throughout this split. You know, Bulldog, I've talked about it a lot, has regressed quite a bit. Wasn't the problem here. The problem, once again, is Pyosik in the jungle, and I just don't hear enough people talking about how horrible Pyosik was in the winter split, in the LCK Cup, throughout 2025 so far. Like, he has just been a negative. Like, there has not been any of the good, you know, positive signs of Pyosik so far. Typically speaking, when you're talking about a player like Pyosik, you're talking about a guy that you just kind of have to take the bad with the good with, because the inconsistency is just so real, and it's so consistently inconsistent, but there's not even any good to go with the bad this year. He is the player on this team that I think is completely throwing off a lot of the communication, a lot of the synergy. I'm not saying it's just him, but you can see like brief glimpses of good synergy between players like Berserker and Life, between players like Bulldog and Life that are trying to make plays together. Bulldog and Dudu, I think, had synergy last year, but Pyosik is just so disconnected from the rest of this roster that it feels almost impossible for them to have any semblance of a good early game. Pyosik has to be a different player, like in spring. spring, or they're going to have to replace him, because you cannot trot out a jungler like this. If there weren't players like Raptor and Hambach that I think really struggled throughout the beginning of this split, Pioshik would really be in the running for worst jungler in the league so far in 2025, and that's just not something they signed him to be. I also do think Berserker and Life are not quite in the spot they were at the beginning of the year, where it felt like they were kind of salvaging some moments for this team. It really does feel like Life in particular has really started struggling now that he feels like he has more responsibility. Berserker's just making like all of these hero plays. He's trying his best to be like the guy here, you know, the Cloud9 version of Berserker, but not only is he playing against much better competition, but this is even kind of what happened in North America on Cloud9 last year, when he felt like he had to be the hero through a lot of the spring split, where these plays just aren't working out. He's flashing forward in order to try to pick up kills that aren't really all that necessary, wasting valuable resources that he needs later on in these fights. He doesn't feel particularly adept at champions like Ziggs. You know, I just don't think it's a good meta for him, and I also, again, just think DNF is kind of scrambled in terms of their communication, which just isn't very good. Teddy is a good enough player to be able to take advantage of that, and, you know, UCal obviously dominated this game, so even if I like Berserker, and I think he's been fine, I think him and Life could theoretically be a good bot lane moving forward. Jungle is a disaster. Mid lane played well and still got absolutely trounced, and, you know, top lane just wasn't enough of an impact to actually change things. DNF is a team that needs a lot of adjustments moving into the spring split, but they're going to have to make them. There were expectations on this team, and they are not being met right now. For DRX, really nice win. Really happy to be able to see them move on. It's probably not going to get better in round number 2. Basically, anybody who wins in round 1 is going to be an underdog in round 2, just considering the top 2 teams here in the play-in stage, but all they need to do is be the 3rd best team in this play-in bracket, and with UCal playing the way that he is, it's a super reasonable thing to expect. But then moving on to our second first round matchup, our second, I guess, elimination matchup here in the best of 3 stage. Nongshim RedForce taking on OK BRION, and again, pretty predictably, Nongshim is going to be able to pick up a victory here. This isn't really all that much of a surprise considering how the LCK Cup went. I was right to not really bro leave going into this split. A lot of people said that I was undervaluing and underestimating bro after they did so well in Kespa. I put them at number 9 in my power rankings at the beginning of the split. And once again, I just want to remind people, it's really freaking hard to be a rookie in the LCK. I know I'm beating a dead horse on this channel. I've said it every single week, but, you know, there are a lot of people that tune in for these play-in, playoff-esque videos that don't necessarily watch a lot of the other content. So I just want to remind people, rookies in the LCK, they are not historically good. It's really rare for somebody to come in and just instantly be good, especially if you're not being thrust into a good team immediately. Obviously, we're seeing someone like Smash come in and be really good, someone like Siwoo coming in and being good, even someone like Pays a couple of years ago obviously coming in and being really good, but when you look at these middle to below tier teams, you're not really seeing guys come in and look great. Even guys who end up becoming great often look pretty, you know, suspect, we'll just say, at the beginning of their career. Someone like Lucid, I think, is a really good example of that, and so having a team where your best players are all rookies, or at least the ones you're relying on to win you games, they're all rookies, it's just not a strategy for success from day number 1. I hope that they can continue to grow and learn, but we're definitely seeing the pitfalls of that, and Nongshim is certainly a good enough team to be able to take advantage of that. I think they've evolved in a couple of areas that I'm excited about, a couple of players that I think have overperformed expectations this year so far, so we'll go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Lehens in the support position. I think you could give this to a variety of different people, but how do I not give this to the River Shen for game number 2? What a ridiculously crazy game. I mean, truly, I've never seen someone pull out support Shen and be as aggressively dominant in terms of taking away the enemy jungler's resources as Lehens was here. We've talked about it so much on this channel, but it's very clear what Lehens' game plan is going into basically every series that they think that they can win, like everything that's not against the top 4 teams, and that's get Lehens out on the map, get him to create as much chaos and havoc as possible, even if that means he has to sacrifice himself in a lot of these cases, and then just hope and pray that whatever resources Lehens is able to generate is more valuable than the resources that whoever they're playing against is able to generate. He is going to sacrifice his life in order to be this psychotic creator for this team, and that's exactly what he was here again. I think the scoreline would indicate that maybe he was a little bit less valuable than you would think, but a lot of that was on the Nautilus in game number 1, and even if I don't think that game was like particularly brilliant or anything like that, he still was very good at being able to set things up for the Kai'Sa and for the Taliyah in that first game, and then obviously he's getting player of the series for this Shen game in game number 2, so I continue to be really impressed by Lehens. I was worried he was going to come to this team and just not look particularly good because the rest of the roster isn't particularly good. Typically, it's hard to stand out as a support if everything else is just kind of falling apart. But he's actively shown why he should be considered one of the best supports in the world very much still, because he is coming out here with, I would say a decent collection of talent, but certainly not an established collection of talent, and still elevating them to be able to win games consistently. The player that I think Broadcast gave player of the series to was Kingen. I think a lot of this is for some flashy plays on the Camille at the end of game 2. I didn't think Kingen was particularly exceptional here. I think I'm actually a lot more hyped about Gideon in the jungle, who just continues to look better and better. We were already starting to get on the Gideon hype train in spring of last year for Bro before they randomly ended up replacing him. You know my thoughts on Bro's management. I think this team is incompetent and has absolutely no idea how to run a team, but Gideon ends up leaving and comes over here to Nongshim at the beginning of the year, replacing Sylvie. This has obviously turned out to be a great decision because Gideon has continued to improve. He has continued to look very good at being able to push advantages and leads, which again, his support is really good at being able to get him. Lehens just absolutely tormented Hanwha in this series, which was the right call. Again, we'll get to that when we get to the Bro section, but Gideon is really starting to impress me as a player that I think could become, like a league average to slightly above league average jungler at this level. Like, is there a lot stopping him from being a top 4, top 5 jungler? Not in terms of like mechanical skill. He can definitely get there. It's just kind of been circumstance, and it's taken him a while to really show that that promise is real, but it's definitely real right now. I think Fisher has taken major leaps forward. He's actually been really good in the past 2 weeks. It's been really fun to watch. Fisher is a player who's been kind of a disaster every single place he has been. Obviously was not particularly good in the LPL or the LDL, and then gets called up to the LPL because EDG at that point have invested so much into trying to get him to be a good player, and he is miserable, truly gets completely exposed at the LPL level, comes over here to the LCK last year on Nongshim and isn't particularly good, but they want to give him one more shot because he is such a highly touted prospect. And now you put him with guys like Gideon, who are playing well, and someone like Lehens, who's just such a good creator, and Fisher all of a sudden has more options to be able to play with. It does feel like he's getting more comfortable, and he was really good here. Jiwoo is a very good AD carry at being able to capitalize on the things that Lehens creates. This is very sneakily turning into a very fun team to watch, and I'm hoping that that development can continue. I think that they have a star player that you can play around in Lehens, and the worry was that their weakest players were just going to be the weakest on the Rift, but the middle of the map has generally been fine for them. So we'll see what happens with Nongshim. It is just Bro, not the most impressive win in the world, but still a very good 2-0. And then for Bro on the other side, again, this is just who they are. This is who we kind of expected them to be at the end of the day, which is a team with some potential, and, they show flashes. Players like Hype, I think, have shown quite a few flashes. Closer has honestly been fine over the course of this split. He's not been, a carry or anything like that, but I would argue that he's been more individually impressive than he has been in a little while on Bro this year, if only because he's actively winning in a situation that's not conducive to winning. His jungler is getting abused by every single team they play against. Morgan has been good on the top side, expectedly good. He's been the player everybody thought he would be, but the negatives of this team very much outweigh the positives right now, and really the big negative is Hanwha. He has just been horrible at the LCK level so far. He's going to get yet another dud of the game, or dud of the series. I know a lot of people really like Hanwha. I was high on his tape as well. I thought he was a really good jungler. I didn't think he was quite as impressive to me as someone like Hype, coming out of the KT Challengers team. He wasn't the star player of that Challengers team, but he definitely was somebody that people had real expectations for at the LCK level. It's hard to be a rookie in the LCK, especially in the jungle role, and unfortunately for Hanwha, he's just been mega exposed throughout the beginning of this split. He is a very predictable player, and he's very one-dimensional at the current moment. His early games are just not good enough to be able to play against the actually good junglers in the LCK. He's a really good team fighter, and he can get to that stage, but he's inconsistent in that stage anyways. He has heavy, flashy, big play moments. He's a playmaker in team fights, but he's really not somebody who is a dominant carry consistently, and again, if his early games are going to be that bad, they've been the worst in the entire league by far, it's going to be really difficult to find a niche or find a role for him to be able to capitalize on. He needs to get better. He was the problem for this team this split. Not the only problem, but definitely the biggest, I would say, problem for this team this split, and obviously they're going to stick by him because they should. You should give rookies time to get used to the league as a whole, but this is the problem. Rookies don't really get a chance to be I guess, ushered in to the league because they are constantly having to face good competition regularly in the LCK. It's trial by fire, and unfortunately, Hanwha is really struggling with that right now. Polu, I think, has kind of reverted to what he was last year. He started off okay, I would say, in this split, but he has been really bad the past week or so. Like I said, Hype shows flashes, but is way too aggressive for the team that he's on right now. He needs to play a lot safer because he's the only one with any chance of being able to win team fights for this team right now. Closer's been fine, and Morgan has been fine. Like, the veterans on this team have been fine, but this team is not good enough enough to be able to rely on, Morgan and Closer to be able to carry them across the finish line. Like, that's just not what Bro is. That's not what those players are. Like, they're not going to be able to carry teams at the LCK level. They're going to be fine if they're secondary or tertiary pieces, but they're not for this team right now. So Bro being out as one of the first teams here, it's not surprising to me even after their Kespa Cup performance. We say it every year. Kespa Cup performance does not indicate LCK success. It basically never has, and this was just another example of that. Then for Nongshim, I'm really starting to get intrigued by this team. Obviously, it doesn't get easier in round 2. They got to go play T1 now, which is never really a great matchup for a team, but even if they lose to them, all they have to do is go on and beat the loser of the other game of Hanwha Life and DRX, which is a winnable series for Nongshim. They have a lot of things going for them right now. They're more well-rounded, I would say, than a team like DRX, even if I don't know if they necessarily have the star power, but Lehens is incredibly good. He's still playing like one of the best supports in the world, and that's going to elevate Nongshim beyond, again, a lot of these other middle table teams. But now that we've gotten through round number 1, it's time to jump into round 2, and these are our qualifying best of 3s. Of course, 2 new teams, the top 2 seeds enter here. They play the winners from that round 1, and these will be the teams that qualify to be the number 4 and 5 seeds going into the playoffs. Our first matchup as we transition from one Nongshim series to another, it's T1 taking on Nongshim RedForce, and T1 is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. This is entirely anticipated, entirely expected, even with Nongshim taking a step forward and not really being all that bad, all things considered, in this series. T1 definitely outplayed them, outclassed them, and honestly just kind of styled on them in a couple of pretty key ways. This was a pretty disrespectful performance for T1. They just came out to send a message, and that message was absolutely sent. They are going to pick up the victory, and they are going to be moving on as the number 4 seed. Since they were number 1 seeded here in the play-ins, they will guarantee be the highest seed going in to the playoffs that is available, which is that number 4 seed. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is basically got to go to Keria. I mean, this was highlight play after highlight play after highlight play on the Pyke. The synergy that him and Owner have as a duo is genuinely ridiculous when it's pulled off at an incredible level. You have Owner going in and insecting people on Lee Sin, and then Keria hitting Pyke Qs out of the insect. It's like genuinely absurd how in sync these two players are, and you don't really get that kind of synergy, not only from other teams, but you need like a baseline level of best player in the world caliber mechanics in order to even pull that off if you have good synergy. And so it's just ridiculous, right? Like, Keria is unreal when he's playing well, and, a lot of people are hyping up Smash, me included. Smash has been pretty phenomenal, in my opinion, one of the best rookie performances so far that we have seen in a very long time. He has shown that he's not just along for the ride when it comes to T1, like, he can be a primary carry option for this team if they really want him to be, but his transition has been so much easier because he gets to play with Keria in the 2v2 every single game. Like, most other rookies don't get that kind of opportunity. When you talk about someone like Hype or Hambach over on Bro that we already talked about with like rookies not succeeding, they have to play with like, Morgan and Closer being their transitional players. And while those players are fine at this level, like getting to play with Keria, it's a completely different beast game in and game out. And so, yes, Smash has been great, but I don't want to undersell how good Keria has been for T1 across this split. And this was one of the flashiest performances that we have seen in the world so far. That Pyke game was genuinely ludicrous in game number 2. Owner, of course, is also part of why that went so well. Owner has been spectacular so far in 2025. There have been a couple of slip-ups. Like, he's not the most consistent player in the world when you're looking at a couple of their losses. He didn't look perfect against D plus Kia, right? Like, it wasn't exactly the most dynamic performance in the world. Lucid had a very good series, and you're hoping Owner can perform better in those high pressure, best of 5 situations. But when he gets to play against these players that he is just so much better than, like, he absolutely styles on them. And even in their series against Gen G, Owner has looked really good. So really impressed with Owner so far. I think he's having one of his better regular seasons, if you want to call it that, in a while. This has been a very consistent, impressive performance. Faker was phenomenal in this series. He truly was just excellent. Typically speaking, Faker actually underperforms against former T1 prodigy, like former T1 challengers players, I should say, players like Fisher, players like Closer. It's been pretty, I guess, regular for him to have his worst performances of the regular season against those players in particular, but I guess he didn't really get the memo on this one. His Corki in game 2 was really excellent. I know people are really down on that champion, especially here in the LCK, but Faker makes it look incredibly busted, and so it's still very fun to watch. Smash continues to be very consistent, just a really great follow-up on a lot of the creation tools, and Doran has been great for this team, was definitely better than Kingen on the other side. T1 feels like the second second best team in the LCK right now. I had them ranked as such coming into the play-ins and the playoffs and, all of that. I think they're very much still on that trajectory. There was absolutely nothing here to dissuade me from feeling that still. And then for Nongshim, again, they're not out by any means because they won that round 1 series. They will be going on to a best of 5 play-in to get that number 6 seed against whichever team loses the series after this, but this is not a surprise. Being able to, take on T1 is a pretty monumental task. This team is playing really well at the moment, and Nongshim just doesn't have the firepower. Lehens continues to try and be the most aggressive player, the most risky player on the Rift, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When you're playing against teams that are better than than Nongshim, I should say, it's not going to work out. You're just going to get a little bit exposed, and that's what happened here. This Elise got absolutely destroyed in game number 2. I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times on this channel. I'm really not a fan of support Elise in pro play. I think you have to be so much better than your opponent to be able to make it work, and that just was never going to happen against T1. Even with as good of a player as Lehens is, you're just never going to be able to pull that off super consistently against a team like T1. You need to take a lot of these risks, and honestly, you kind of need the enemy team to mess up at least a little bit in terms of where they, protect a lot of their pressure from, and that just wasn't going to happen here today. Lehens definitely was not what he was in round 1. He is going to get dud of the series, even if I think, he played the same basically as he did in that series against Bro. He just got exposed a bit more because he can't pull off a lot of those risky, aggressive plays against teams that are as good as T1 is. I think the rest of the team was generally fine. Kingen got obliterated on the top side and was entirely useless on that Anivia. In game number 2, we're seeing that champion pick up some priority as a counter pick on the top side, but again, another champion that I think you kind of have to get to late game to really properly utilize in the way that you want to. Everybody else was fine. Fisher was generally fine. Jiwoo was generally fine. Gideon was generally fine, but Nongshim was just outclassed. There really isn't a lot of analysis that I can give. This team is not as good as T1 on the other side. They just got hands diffed basically everywhere T1 was out to prove a point and to send a message, and that point was proven and that message was definitely sent. This team will be moving on to playoffs with about as much momentum as you could possibly ask for, and they still are a gigantic threat and maybe even one of the favorites to end up winning the LCK and representing this region at first stand. And then moving on to our second of the round 2 series, our second of these best of 3 qualifiers, and it's the other side of the matchup. It's technically a 2 versus 3 seed. Should be close. Probably won't be, considering the 2 teams that are involved, but it definitely was a little bit more hyped. It was Hanwha Life Esports taking on DRX, and again, predictably, Hanwha Life is going to pick up the 2-0. I don't think a lot of people anticipated T1 and HLE having any problems in this play-in bracket. They were likely going to be the 2 teams that went through, but HLE definitely running into a bit more resistance, I would say, in this one than T1 did against Nongshim, not only because I do think DRX is a little bit more competent at being able to take advantage of, decent situations, like Nongshim kind of needs the other team to be bad or to make mistakes in order for them to push themselves forward, but because Hanwha Life is definitely not on the level of a team like T1 right now, at least in terms of what we've seen consistency-wise over the course of this split, we will definitely talk about that, but I do think it's important to point out that this maybe wasn't the most strategic win in Hanwha Life's history. A lot of people were saying that they should lose this on purpose because losing this would mean that, you can go on to that best of 5, potentially take on a team like Nongshim. You should be able to beat them relatively easily, and then you go on as the number 6 seed, which would mean you would play KT Rolster. But now, because you win this series, you're going on to play T1 in the first round of the playoffs. And so definitely not an ideal set of circumstances for HLE. We'll see how they can overcome it, but let's talk about what actually happened on the Rift in this series. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Zeka. He had a really good bounce back here. He was not really all that great in their last series of the year. Definitely wanted to see more out of him coming off of the regular season. Not that he was horrible, just that so many mid laners ended up really stepping up. UCal on the other side is a great example of that. Players like UCal and BDD and, Faker and Chovy, they were all super excellent across this entire split. Even I didn't even mention Showmaker, right? Zeka was maybe the 6th best mid laner in the LCK in the regular season, and that's just not where you would want to see Zeka in terms of these rankings. It goes to show how good that position is. Not that that's really a surprise, but he can still pop off. He can still take over games, and that's exactly what he did in the back half here. The Galio was instrumental towards HLE's success and their victory, and generally they needed him because the rest of this team continues to look rather inconsistent. I don't really know what to say. It doesn't really feel like HLE have great chemistry, which is strange because you're bringing back 4 of the 5 members of the team last year that ended up winning the LCK and, just barely losing to the team that would, make finals at Worlds, and, they looked really good throughout all of 2024, and it's just weird that so much of that has has not translated to this year. I don't know if it's just the way that this team communicates on the new map or whatever it is, but players like Viper, Delight, Peanut, Zeus obviously coming in, they just feel a little bit off here. And I think if they were playing a better team, we would have seen, them be taken advantage of more. I do think you can point out Viper just stepping up for no reason and getting picked off and not really being in proper spots. Teddy just kind of completely outplaying him in this series, which we will kind of talk about. Delight being probably the best player on this team in the regular season. I don't think he was a superstar in this series. I like that he is playing a lot more aggressive. I think he realizes he needs to be a little bit more of a spark plug for this team in terms of what he's putting out, but Ondol wasn't really offering a lot of resistance. He still was giving gold over to Teddy, though, on the other side. It's not like this bot lane was perfect. Peanut continues to have some really questionable moments, and if Sponge wasn't actively inting on the other side of this matchup, I would have been a bit more concerned about Peanut. Zeus has not really settled in and been like a superstar top laner for HLE. There are real concerns, and every single time we talk about this team, even in their wins, it's always, one or two players end up playing really, really well. In this case, Zeka really pops off and carries the team, and everybody else just randomly plays bad and plays worse than expected. There's really no other way to say it. This time, it was Zeka stepping up, and it was everybody else still underperforming, but this team has not shown any semblance of consistency, and they certainly have not shown the ability to play really well across the board so far this year. Very, very strange. I don't really know what the problem is. I don't even know what the solution would be in a circumstance like that, but, picking up a victory is all that really matters here at the end of the day, I guess, even if they didn't look particularly great doing it, in my opinion. And for DRX, there are some encouraging traits to walk out of this with. I think a lot of people continue to die on the hill that Teddy is elo held or that he's hard stuck, but I want to ask you this. Is there not some sort of correlation to draw between the idea that Teddy plays really well and has all the resources and his team loses? There is a correlation there, and I know that people don't really want to hear that, or people don't really want to talk about that, but when Teddy is the primary option on a team, when he is asked to be the guy that steps up and is the number one option for a particular series, that's not a good sign for your team. It just doesn't mean that you're going to be in a good position. When DRX is at their best, Teddy is the second or third option on this team. In this series, he was not. He was really good. I'm not trying to critique Teddy. What I'm trying to say is that, he is not the kind of player that is going to be able to be your best player and have you win. And we've seen that over and over and over and over again. Every single stop he has been on, when he has found success at the LCK level, it's been because he's surrounded by other good players. And again, if UCal's going to have, I wouldn't even say an off series, but not a dominant series. This is off in comparison to what he has been throughout the rest of this split. He was fine in this series, but he certainly wasn't a carry. You're not really getting all that much out of the top side of the map. Both Rich and Sponge were pretty bad. I would say all things considered, Sponge in particular, as you can see, is dud of the series, but we'll get to him in a moment. When you're going to have the other members of this team underperform, Teddy is not the kind of player that can step up and really make that worthwhile. I get the stats look good and the team fighting looks good, but he's not aggressive enough. He doesn't have the agency in the mid game to be able to set up DRX to be able to capitalize on some of these things. And so if Zeka is also playing well on the other side, he's just going to have more tempo and he's just going to be able to control the game a lot more, which we saw. It's not really Teddy's fault. I'm not trying to sit here and blame Teddy for this. I'm just getting really sick and tired of the Reddit narrative that Teddy is constantly elo held or hard stuck on every team that he's on, when at some point we have to put the pieces together and say that the best case scenario for Teddy is that he's the third best player on his team, and that he can rely on others to be primary options where he can just be stable and a secondary carry. That was not the case in this series. It is worth noting that his team inted him, right? Ondol and Sponge were horrible here. Sponge is going to get done of the series. If you wanted to give this to Ondol, I think that that's entirely fair as well. Sponge looked really good against Pioshik, who has been awful, but maybe Sponge is just one of those players that's going to do fine against the junglers that are running it, Hambach, Pioshik, as we've already talked about, Raptor. I could see a world in which Sponge just does a really good job of taking advantage of those teams, but, going up against someone like Peanut, even when he's really not playing his best league right now, it's still a complete mismatch. And then Ondol is just not good enough to be able to go up against top teams. We've seen that pretty consistently, I would say. Over the course of his career, he's, fine, and, I think you can make an argument he's average. I wouldn't. I think he's a below average support at this level, and I still would really like to see Playta in the starting lineup, but, he really struggled here. Rich is just not a superstar. He's one of the weaker top laners in the league. He just doesn't really have a lot of X-Factor traits. He's a really good team fighter, but he's a miserable laner, and that just sets him behind so far. UCal and Teddy were fine. Like, UCal was okay in this series, but he needs to have, like, a superhuman effort for DRX to win games, especially against top teams, and that just didn't happen here. And so I hope you guys can understand, you know, the conversation that I have surrounding Teddy. It's not that I think Teddy is a bad player, just that I think the narrative surrounding Teddy is completely misguided and doesn't really accurately represent who he is as a player. So let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments, but at least HLE won, right? Like, maybe they would have liked to lose this. Again, go on to play Nongshim and, you know, try to win that best of 5 and get that number 6 seed to have an easier matchup in round 1. But there are so many things that this team needs to fix. I think it's reasonable to expect this team to not make round 2 in the actual playoffs. I know they're really good, and I know they're coming off of an LCK championship, but there's just something off about this team that I can't quite quantify right now. But that's going to bring us to our 5th series of the week here and our final one of this play-in stage. It is now time for our first best of 5 of the winter split, and it will be for the final playoff spot. It's Nongshim RedForce taking on DRX. And Nongshim is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. They will be the team moving on as the number 6 seed to the playoffs, and DRX getting a little bit upset here. I'm not going to say this is the biggest upset in the world, because again, DRX is a very limited team. They are not a team that I would have guaranteed was top 6 going into the playoffs, but I think they had expectations of being able to come into a series like this and show that they are better than a lot of the other middle table teams. But some of the excitement that we saw from Nongshim, not only earlier in the week, but generally speaking, throughout the entire split, it very much came to a head in this series where I honestly think almost everybody on the team played really well. We've been very vocal on this channel about how good Lehens has been and about how important he has been towards Nongshim's success, but it kind of was everybody on the team in this one that just kind of outplayed DRX. And, you know, to DRX's credit, they had a couple of good performances. They just weren't good enough. They're relying on their best players being the best on the Rift, and that was not the case here today. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, to me, pretty obviously is going to go to Gideon in the jungle. I'm so impressed with what Gideon has become as a jungler at the LCK level. I was really not a fan of his in the LPL when he had his brief stint there. It felt like he wasn't necessarily progressing the way that I would have liked. I liked him individually as a player when he was playing in the Challengers League many years ago, but it never really felt like he was going to turn into like an actual good player. He kind of had the trajectory at that time of somebody who was just going to get a couple of chances on bottom tier teams, be average to slightly below average, and then never really be able to climb up the ranks in that way. But something did change for me in terms of perception on Bro last year, where it felt like he was making a lot out of nothing with that team. It felt like he was doing quite a bit on a team that just really struggled to create in any facet in 2024. Ends up getting replaced going into summer. I was very critical of that decision at the time. I think Youngjae's a good player, but Gideon was showing a lot of promise, and I was frustrated that he wasn't given more of an opportunity there. And then obviously he comes over here to Nongshim very late into the offseason. He is one of the last signed players. I actually just got him into the graphic for my preseason like primer video before it ended up going out, because it was supposed to be Sylvie starting in the jungle for at least a majority of this offseason, but they bring in Gideon, and his trajectory has continued to grow. He has shown a lot of the good traits that he showed on Bro, but it's been, I would argue, even better over the course of 2025 so far. Again, very small sample size. I'm not going to sit here and say that this guy is on like superstar trajectory, but the arrow is pointing upwards, and I think that that is a really good sign. He was just straight up better than Sponge in this series. Not that Sponge is a particularly phenomenal player. He has his flaws, but Gideon did a great job of being able to capitalize on the mistakes that DRX and Sponge were making, and honestly push the entire team forward. When he is the most important player in a best of 5 that qualifies you for playoffs, that's a really good spot to be in if you want Gideon to be a success at this level. So I've been pretty impressed with Gideon. I think he's been this team's second best player throughout this year so far, throughout 2025. Of course, Lehens is the most important player on this team. Wasn't quite as impactful, I would say, in this series as he has been in the past. Still is super aggressive, still is definitely going to try to pick these playmakers and go out and be the primary option, the primary facilitator for this team. I think he got to be a little bit more secondary in this series because Gideon was so good on champions like Maokai and on Poppy and these more facilitative type of champions. Lehens, I think, understood that he could take a little bit more of a step back in this best of 5 as opposed to what he usually is, because he was getting that kind of performance out of his jungler. But when he needs to step up, we know he can still be the primary guy here. Jiwoo and Fisher were excellent as a carry duo in this series. UCal and Teddy are the strength of DRX, and both Fisher and Jiwoo came out with kind of a point to prove, I think, to show that they are on the same level, if not above, those other players. I mean, Fisher is not above UCal. I'm not trying to make that statement, but Fisher was awesome in this series. Really did a great job on these 80 carries in the middle of the map to be able to open things up. Was still very good on Talia in game number 4 as well, but if you would have asked me what the biggest mismatch was going into this series where I thought Nongshim was going to falter, it would have been mid lane, because Fisher, I just expected to kind of get trounced by UCal. That is not what happened here. Fisher was excellent. Jiwoo continues to be really good. Sometimes can be a bit too far forward. I think he really wants to follow Lehens on a lot of his more aggressive engages, but sometimes that does come back to bite him. He's still a really good player, and in my opinion, has kind of proven that he is better than a player like Teddy on the other side. You know, regardless of what your feelings are on Teddy, that's not necessarily me being low on Teddy, just that I think Jiwoo's a really, really good carry and can be a primary option in a lot of instances. And of course, Kingen was just a better laner than Rich, which I think we all kind of expected. But Nongshim just looking really well-rounded, and that's really not what I thought this team was going to be. You know, their preseason analysis and the conversation surrounding them was always, oh, they're going to be a really top-heavy team. Lehens and Kingen and Jiwoo, they're going to be fine, but the middle of this map is going to be a bit of a disaster, or at the very least, a bit of a question mark. No, they're a lot more well-rounded than I think we gave them credit for, and I think a lot of that is the development of players like Fisher, and then kind of the small breakout that Gideon is having right now. He really was excellent, and he is a big reason why this team is moving on to the playoffs. But for DRX, they're going to find this a little disappointing, I think. I think they came into this with the expectation that they were favorites, and unfortunately, it's just not really how it ended up playing out. UCal didn't have that unbelievable series, although he was pretty good here for DRX. Once again, I'm not going to blame UCal. He has the entire team on his shoulders at the current moment in terms of being able to get them across the finish line. I'm not going to blame Teddy because, you know, Teddy's not the player that loses you games. He's not the one that wins you games, but, like, if Teddy is on the team, he's probably playing fine, and he played fine in this series. You absolutely could have won these games with Teddy in at AD carry. It kind of was the surrounding pieces that just fell a little flat, very similar to what we just talked about in the Hanwha Life series. It was Sponge and Ondil that just weren't good enough to be able to move on. Sponge is going to get dud of the series once again here. Really faltered when it mattered the most. It felt like he was making some nice progressions in the regular season, and then of course in that series in round number 1 against DN Freecs, it felt like he was finally starting to lock things in and get a lot more comfortable. That fell apart once he started playing players that were actually good and actually put up kind of some resistance. I don't think Sponge is the worst jungler in the entire league. I think that has been proven. He's been able to take advantage of the worst junglers in the league, but Sponge is not all of a sudden like a really good jungler or anything like that, or even really an average jungler. It's just a weak position at the LCK level, and I think Sponge was unfortunately kind of a recipient of that, and now is being punished a little bit for it as we go further along. Ondil is also just not good enough for what this team's expectations are. If they want to be top 6, Ondil is not a top 6 support. Playta is a top 6 support. I know I feel like a broken record when I say that, but how many times do we have to see that this team needs a spark plug in the support position, and you have one on roster just sitting in your Challengers League and you're just not utilizing him? It's very frustrating to see, but you know, Ondil was not good enough in their last 2 series. Got outplayed by Delight and Viper, even though they were struggling and even though Teddy was doing well, and then just kind of was a bit of a nuisance for his own team in this series, playing things like Ornn support. So not great. Rich is just very limited as a player. You know, nothing I say here is going to be different than anything I've said for him all video long. He's very bad in lane, and that continues to be a massive issue for DRX, but UCal's awesome. I think you have a lot to build around for this DRX team. UCal and Teddy as a carry duo is definitely good enough to get you top 6, as long as the surrounding, you know, ancillary pieces are good enough to be able to just survive at this level, to allow your best players to be able to carry you. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for DRX here today. They maybe had some of the better players in this series, but Nongshim proved that they are much, much better across the board, and that's what's going to get them into that top 6. They're honestly kind of overperforming my expectations. I expected this Nongshim team to be kind of bad going into the year. Just feels like the way that this roster is constructed, I didn't quite anticipate them to really figure things out. I thought the middle of the map was going to drag them down too much, and we were going to see some, you know, downgraded performances from players like Kingen and Lehens because of the surrounding core, but that's not really been the case. We're seeing a lot of the positives that Lehens has brought to winning teams just now brought to Nongshim, and players like Fisher and Gideon are capitalizing on that. And so really excited to see where Nongshim goes. They get an easier matchup than maybe you would anticipate with a team like KT Rolster. If you can beat DRX, you can probably beat KT Rolster. They are very similar in terms of the way that they play the game, which is get our mid laner fed and hope and pray that he ends up winning us the game. And so we'll see. I don't think Nongshim is like favorites or anything to win a playoff series, but crazier things have definitely happened. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Cup play-ins overview and analysis. You can see the completed bracket up on your screen now. Of course, T1 and Hanwha Life both advancing by winning their qualifier best of threes that left Nongshim and DRX to fight it out for that final spot, which Nongshim takes in 4 in their best of 5. So T1, Hanwha Life, Nongshim, they're going to be moving on. That means joining FearX as eliminated here in the winter split in the LCK Cup. OK BRION, DN Freecs, and DRX. All 3 of those teams are now done for the rest of winter. They will not be making the playoffs, and they will have to wait until the spring split in order to recoup some of their momentum. But that brings us to the official winter playoff bracket. As you can see, this is the regular LCK playoff bracket, the one we are all familiar with, where it's 2 buys in the first round, and then, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5. After you get to round number 2, that's where double elimination starts. So DK and Genji automatically qualifying for the double elimination side by being the 2 best teams in the winners group in the regular season, and then everybody else has to play for their shot. That certainly leaves some interesting matchups, and the seeding has definitely made this intriguing because T1 and Hanwha Life are playing against each other in round number 1. That means one of these teams will not be making the double elimination stage, and honestly, if you want my predictions, I'm going to give them right now, but it should be pretty obvious with how I've talked about these 2 teams who I think is going to be winning this best of 5. I think T1 is just straight up the better team right now, and I don't think it's particularly close. I think Hanwha Life has a ton to figure out and fix. What I will give them credit for is that it seems like they're able to win games, even that they really shouldn't. They're able to capitalize on a lot of the mistakes that enemies make, and they have 1 or 2 players every single game that are just stepping up and being world class like we know they can be, but the inconsistencies are going to cost them against the actual best teams, and T1 is, in my opinion, one of the best teams in the world right now. So I imagine T1 will be moving on as that number 4 seed. And then you've got KT Rolster and Nongshim RedForce. This is also a pretty funny matchup because I think both of these teams would lose to both T1 and Hanwha Life on the other side of the bracket, but this is just how things go with KT being that 3rd team from the winner's bracket. I think Nongshim has a ton of momentum behind them right now, and that's certainly something I'm going to talk about. There's been a big break, a full week break for KT Rolster where they have not played a game on stage, and I don't think KT is quite talented enough to be able to completely overcome that. That being said, KT should be the better team, and I would imagine BDD is by far the best player on the Rift in this series. I think we could be seeing a very similar circumstance to what happened with DRX, where a team relies too much on one player, and if they get taken out of the game, you don't really have a lot of tools to be able to get yourself out of it in other ways. You've had players like Dectum and Wei that have been really horrible for this team this split so far. And so I'm not saying KT is a lock to be able to win this series. I honestly give Nongshim more of a chance to beat KT than I give Hanwha Life a chance to beat T1, if that makes sense. I think this series is closer in my head. It's still not enough for me to not pick KT Rolster because they should be the better of these 2 teams, but I do think this is closer than most people are going to talk about it. Of course, if this ends up being the case, then DK gets selection between KT and T1. They will be choosing KT Rolster. They do not want to play T1. Nobody is going to be picking T1 or Hanwha Life if they come through here. So I imagine things will look pretty identical to the arrows that we have on the screen, with KT going to face DK or Nongshim going to face DK, whoever ends up winning that, and then probably T1 going on to face Genji in that second round, which is certainly a pair of interesting matchups. But let me know if you agree or disagree with those predictions down in the comment section below. Do you also think it will be KT and T1 moving on to round 2, or do you think Nongshim has a chance? Do you think Hanwha Life has a chance that I'm underestimating? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. But that's the playoff bracket. That's kind of the predictions for that. Let's put a bow on everything that happened here in the play-ins and talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week should not really be all that much of a surprise. It's going to be Gideon, the jungler for Nongshim. He was essential towards this team actually making the playoffs this week, being that number 6 seed. He was really great on these facilitators. You can see some of the games next to him, the Sejuani, the Vi, the Maokai. I thought these were his 3 best games of the week. I think you could put even the Lilia loss in game number 2 against DRX in there. You could put the Poppy game in game number 4 from that DRX series in there. I think that there were a lot of, games that were really good from Gideon across this week. And to me, I didn't really have to think about it too much. He was the most valuable player to Nongshim across all 3 of their series. I think Lahens would have gotten a mention if he wasn't so bad against T1, but it's just how the cookie crumbles. Gideon is going to get my player of the week for the play-in stage. My honorable mentions, Zeka and Keria, they don't quite get player of the week because they only played 1 best of 3, whereas Gideon got to play 2 best of 3s and a best of 5, and so it's just not necessarily super comparable in terms of value. But in terms of the players that only played once, Zeka and Keria had 2 of the better games of the entire week, so they definitely deserve to be honorable mentions. Zeka basically hard carried Hanwha Life, and Keria made some of the flashiest plays we've seen in the entire world this year on the Pike in game 2 against against Nongshim, so definitely deserved honorable mentions, but Gideon was a pretty easy choice for player of the week, just considering the structure. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Sponge, the jungler for DRX. I didn't want to give it to Sponge, I really didn't, because he was good in their win over the DN Freecs. But I just couldn't justify not giving dud of the week to somebody who was actively the reason their team was not moving on to the playoffs. I'm not going to say it was entirely him, but he was the biggest problem on DRX in both their losses, both to Hanwha Life and then later on to Nongshim. If he had been remotely league average like he had been performing up until that point, they actually have a real shot to be able to win that because Teddy was playing really well, Yukao was playing really well. I think you had opportunities, but he lost so hard that it ended up really costing DRX, so he's going to be my dud of the week. If you would rather this go to someone like Pioshik or Hambach because they were so bad that they got their team eliminated basically immediately, I think that's fair. I think him being so bad in two different series, a best of 3 and a best of 5, is kind of what pushed him over the top, but it's kind of taking away the fact that he was good in that DN Freecs series. So whoever you kind of want here for dud of the week I think is fair, but I have Sponge and I have Gideon as my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LCK playoffs. They're kicking off really shortly. We're going to be going game by game in a much more thorough breakdown way when we get to these actual best of 5s in the playoffs, so stick around for that. We also, of course, cover all 3 of the other major leagues, so LTA North, LEC, and the LPL. We cover them every week that they play on this channel, so if you're interested in comprehensive overviews of everything going on in LoL esports, especially with First Stand around the corner, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all